or where we all could quote. I want to talk about perspective, how important perspective is in our lives and how it makes a difference. I think I may have told you the story before of a man that had waited so long to get a Cadillac. Just wanted a Cadillac all his life, and finally saved up enough money and took it to the dealership and bought his brand new Cadillac, drove it out of the showroom, was so excited to have it. Was just driving down the highway, stopped at a stoplight, and a guy jumped in the car. It was a convertible. A guy jumped in the car with him, had a gun, took him down to kind of a road where there wasn't anybody, a dirt road, and he got out and drew a circle about 6 feet away from the car, told the man that owned that Cadillac, he said, "You get in that circle, don't you get out of it till I tell you." The man got in the circle, and the guy with the gun proceeded to take a baseball bat that he had with him and started just beating that Cadillac to pieces. He busted both headlights, he busted the taillights, he smashed the dash, broke the windshield, just did everything. And after he was wore out from swinging the bat, he turned around, and the man whose car he had just beat up was bent over laughing with tears coming out of his eyes. And that just made the guy mad. He said, "What is your problem? I've just beat this car up. It's destroyed." And the man said, "Yeah, but while you weren't looking, I got out of that circle 4 times." And so sometimes perspective makes a big difference in our lives. And that man who should have been crying about his car was just happy he'd able to get out of that circle. That was his perspective. And in our circumstances, it is often the perspective that we have that makes a difference in our attitude and how we react and how we pray, how we behave in the middle of those things. And so I just want to talk about perspective in circumstances tonight. And really that's where the Apostle Paul is in Philippians chapter 4 and verse number 11. Let's look at it together. And you all know these verses. "Not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am therewith to be content. I know how both to be abased, and I know how to abound everywhere and in all things. I'm instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me." And so the Apostle Paul is telling the church in the middle of his suffering, because he's in jail. In fact, he is probably dictating this letter from inside the same jail cell where he will be until he dies. That's the understanding. And he gives us an idea of perspective in circumstances. And I think, especially if your candidate has lost in the elections, we might want to back up and get some perspective before we all get completely depressed and have to go on medication. Because perspective matters. It matters in how we react. It matters in how our attitude handles difficult things. And so I want to give you a few things about our circumstances, keeping them in the proper perspective as we go through life. We've seen how contentment in the Christian life is divine because it is from within and not from without. We've seen how in the past messages how contentment, in order to really be contentment, has to be something that's habitual. It's something that has to be day in and day out. We can't just be content on the good days. We have to be content all the time, and that's what contentment is. But all of that is easy to say when things are going well. Wes and I were talking before church where we just want things to go back to normal, and he's like, "Well, I'm not sure what normal is." I can tell you what normal is. I want to go back to the normal of February of this year. That's where I'd like to go back to. No COVID to deal with. The elections weren't up in the air. That's the normal I'd like to get back to. If we just go back to February of 19, we did not know how good we had it, did we? Oh, if I could go back and talk to myself back in February and say, "Hey, buddy, enjoy these last 2 weeks because things are going to get real weird here shortly." But perspective, it makes a difference. And so it's not just when things are good, but also when things are going against me. If I'll keep the right perspective, the right mindset, then it will help me. And so I want to remind us that when we're in difficult situations, when circumstances aren't going our way, there are some things that we ought to keep in mind, some things that we should compare our circumstances to keep our perspective in focus, the right perspective. And so let's look at those things quickly. And first of all, if we want to keep the right perspective, we ought to compare our current circumstances to what we deserve. We ought to compare our current circumstances to what it is that we actually deserve. We may not have everything that we want, but what God has given us is better than what we deserve. It's Dave Ramsey that when somebody asks him, "How you doing?" he says, "Better than I deserve." And it's kind of a cliche, but it's so true. if you and I are in the middle of even our worst circumstances, if we'll be mindful of this thing is difficult and it's hard, but it is not as bad as what I would deserve for it to be, because God has blessed me, and even in the middle of this, He's with us. And so, I mean, I have what I want, but it's not what I deserve. It's better than I deserve. I read of Alexander the Great had given a gift to one of his subjects, and his subject said, "I'm not worthy of it. I don't deserve this." And Alexander said, "No, you don't deserve this, but I'm worthy of giving it to you." It's who's giving the gift. And oftentimes, even in our difficult circumstances, understand that what we're going through is not as bad as what we deserve if God just left us to our own devices. And so it'll help our perspective when we do that. We may be in a difficult situation, but we're better off than what we deserve. The fact is that we deserve none of who God is, none of Him at all, and yet He has given those things to us. We don't deserve anything that He's given us, and yet He's given them to us, and so we don't deserve it. Romans chapter 5 and verse number 6, if you want to write that down, it kind of speaks to that. But He made Him to be sin for us. We didn't deserve it, but He made Himself to be sin for us. Boy, you can't hardly see that stuff, can you? That was a terrible color choice. I apologize. Just listen, I'll tell you. I'll start yelling out letters so you'll know if you're taking notes. And sorry, Ken and Diane, you probably can't see it at all on the screen. That's my fault. It looked really cool on the computer before I put it up there. The fact is, we don't deserve God's presence, and yet He's given it to us, even in difficult moments. And that really is where our perspective comes from in hard times. That I may be in the middle of something that's awful, and I wouldn't pick it, and if I could choose my circumstances, this would have been the last thing I would have picked. But even in that, God has not left us alone. Kind of reminded of the book of Acts, chapter number 27, with the Apostle Paul in the middle of that storm. And those men on the ship with him were panicked, and they were terrified, and they had thrown out all of the goods that the ship was going to take with them one day, and then a couple of days later, when things didn't get any better, they started throwing out everything except the boards on the bottom of the ship. They threw it all out. All the tackling, all the food, all the supplies were gone. They were scared to death. And the Apostle Paul, in the middle of this, if you can in your mind imagine this storm that was so bad that they hadn't seen the sun or the stars. They didn't know it was day or night. They didn't know how many days had passed. They just know it had been a long time. In the middle of all of that, you can almost hear a calming, as it says, and then in the middle of all that, David came and stood, or Paul came and stood. He hadn't been with them in a while, and he said, "Hey guys, calm down. Hang on. Don't worry. Don't be afraid. Because," y'all remember why? He said, "Because tonight there stood by me the angel of God." And then he says, "Who I am and whom I serve." And so we talk about keeping our circumstances in perspective. If we compare it to what we deserve and realize we don't deserve God's presence in the middle of difficulty, and yet He is there every step of the way with us. That old gospel song that said, "He's still in the fire and He's walking the flames, and He'll be there to help you when you call on His name." It's true. And we don't deserve that, and yet He's so good to us that He's given us Himself. And so we ought to compare our circumstances to those circumstances that we deserve, because we're in a better shape than what we deserve. In every struggle, God's promised to be with us. In fact, the book of Hebrews chapter 13, the Apostle Paul says, in the middle of circumstances, we can say that we're okay because He said, "I'll never leave you nor forsake you." So that we can boldly say, "The Lord's my helper in time of trouble." So we don't deserve all that He's given us. So I should compare my circumstances to what I deserve. Let me say, number two, we should compare our circumstances to the circumstances of others. Now, I don't mean this by comparing what other people have to what I have, because that's called envy, and that's sin. But what I am saying is, when you and I think we have it so bad, we really don't. Let me give you some examples of people that have had it worse than us. You can't see it. So letter A, if you're taking notes, some of the saints of the Old Testament had it worse than us. I mean, sure, Job was never stuck in the house or having to wear a face mask when we went into Walmart, but then Job didn't have Walmart to go into, and it was Job that we find sitting in a pile of ashes with sores from the crown of his head to the sole of his feet, with the loss of everything. Job's got it worse than we have it. Job had it worse than us. You think it's bad just going through life now? Can you imagine being stuck on an ark with 2 of every animal, 7 of the clean animals, for an extended period of time? I can't imagine that. And yet there's Noah. Can't go out, can't leave. That's not exactly a cruise that we would all take nowadays. I look at Elijah at moments in his life, even after he had slain 450 prophets of Baal, Jezebel said that she's going to kill him like he killed them. He takes off running and feels like he's the only one. He's got it worse than us. In fact, he was no food and had to wait for ravens to come and drop food for him. I read that story and I wonder, you know how birds feed their babies? I just hope that's not how Elijah got fed, because that's disgusting. That went from a real blessing to just a real trial of faith if that's how he's having to eat. I don't know if that has worked that way, but you never know. And then you look at people like Isaiah or Jeremiah that preached and preached and preached and seemed like they didn't reach anybody. Men like Nehemiah, who was first a slave, and then God begins to use him, and he gets to Jerusalem where he's supposed to rebuild the walls, and even his fellow countrymen started to work against him to the point that they had to work with a weapon in one hand and their tools in the other. You get into the New Testament, you read about men like John the Baptist, just preaching the message he was called to preach and ends up in jail. And ultimately loses his head. John the Revelator, because of his faith, ends up exiled on the Isle of Patmos. Historians say that he was boiled alive. It's worse than I've got it. And so there are saints of old that had it worse than me. So when I'm struggling, when my circumstances are difficult, I ought to compare it not just to what I deserve, but also compare it to others, because the saints of the Old Testament had it worse. Let me say this also, B, because you can't see it. Yep. Sometimes I can just look around and see that people have it worse than me. It's the truth. Even when I'm thinking I'm having a bad day, it doesn't take me long to know even just the small group of people that I know. Somebody in my peer group, somebody in my circle of influence is always struggling worse than I am. When I look at them struggling, whether it's with health or with finances or with other things, it ought to keep my troubles in perspective. And I'm having this as an inconvenience, but what's so-and-so going through? That brother that got bit by the snake, y'all know that is worst case scenario for me. If I was to draw up scenarios in which my life has taken a horrible turn, that's like number 1 through 10 on that list. It's a snake bite somehow. And thinking about that and how awful that's got to be, and now the recovery. Brother Denver, you know what he's going through. And so I've got the sniffles, okay, but I'm not worried about losing my arm. So when I begin to look at those around me with circumstances that they're in, mine don't seem so bad after all. I mean, my ankle hurts. I end up limping around here, and my boys make fun of me, especially after we play basketball. As bad as that might seem like it hurts me, we got Jehaziel, who's a teenager, getting ready to go in and have his leg wide open so they can cut off the bone. Then they can put that skin back over the end to make a stump that he can actually put a prosthetic in. There are people around that have it worse than me. And so saints of old, the people around me, and then let me just say this, if the saints of God in the past have dealt with difficulty and done it with contentment, I feel like I ought to be able to do the same. I feel like I ought to be able to, if I look at what those old saints of old and even those around me have gone through, I ought to be able to handle those circumstances a little bit. There's a song in our hymn book, I don't think we sing it at this church, but one of the verses says this, "Must I be carried to the skies on flowery beds of ease, while others fought to win the prize and sailed through bloody seas? Sure, I must fight if I would reign, increase my courage, Lord. I'll bear the toil, endure the pain, supported by your word." When the battle's over, I shall wear a crown. That's the chorus of that song. You and I shouldn't expect that if godly men and women of the past, and even some godly men and women around us are having difficult circumstances, we should never expect that our lives should be nothing but, he says it in the song, flowery beds of ease. And by the way, the message, the preaching that preaches that it should be is heretical, false. It's false. It's just not biblical doctrine. And so I should compare my circumstances to what I deserve. I should compare it to those around me. It will help keep my focus and keep my perspective right. I may be struggling with this, and maybe things aren't shaking out the way I'd planned, but it sure could be worse, or I deserve worse, or this is not what I wanted for my life, but look, there are other people that are struggling more than me, and that should make me to be a little more content. Let me give you number 3. We need to compare our circumstances to what Christ endured in his earthly life. 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse number 9. So if we're going to look at the ultimate example of how we are to live, it's Christ, right? We're to follow after him. I ought to keep my circumstances in perspective when I compare them to his. I mean, we talk about Christ, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and yet he had nothing. In fact, Jesus in his preaching said, the birds have nests, the fox have holes, and yet what did he say about the Son of Man? Doesn't even have a pillow to lay his head on. Had to pay taxes, and what is it he had to do? He had to have one of his disciples go get it out of a fish's mouth because he didn't have money to pay taxes. And I don't know the circumstances of everybody in here, but I'm fairly confident our taxes are going to be paid. If not, and you're a conservative Christian, you probably should pay them now because the next administration may start an audit on all of us. The fact is, we have it better compared to what Christ, our head, had it when he was here. He had no bed, no home, and no place to go for rest. I mean, if you look at the story of him with the woman at the well, you find him in the middle of the day when everyone else was in their homes. Just him and this woman who was out here because she was ashamed to be out when everyone else was, and here they are in the heat of the day. He's trying to get some rest. And so when we compare our situation to Christ, who was the King of Kings, he had nothing. If Christ the Creator was content to live the way that he lived, shouldn't we be content to live the way that God has allowed us to live? Shouldn't we be content where we are? And it's really convicting when I look at the way he lived his life and no complaining. In fact, you don't see Christ trying to get the best shoes or the best mode of transportation or a nicer house. He's always working to meet other people's needs, even in the middle of his desire or needs not being met. And so when we compare it to the way that Christ lived as a contented servant, Philippians chapter 2 and verse 6 and 7, that he humbled himself and became obedient in life and then even to the death of the cross, is what Philippians chapter 2 says. He lived and he died poor so that we could live and die rich. And when we compare our circumstances to our head, that is Christ, it'll keep my perspective straight. Someone said he had no home of his own, so he could come and give us mansions to call our own one day. It's an amazing thing that the way Christ lived, and we ought to be able to be the same way. We also can see that even when Christ was on the cross, he was content. We're talking about it. We'll do it again this Sunday morning. Last Sunday we talked about his first phrase from the cross, Father, forgive them. But if you take a trip out in the upper room and down into the Mount of Olives there in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he was among the olive trees and had gone by himself to pray, and he begins to pray, and he's in an agony. That word agony, it's a Greek word that we get wrestling. That's the kind of torment he was in already. And he begins to pray, and he says, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. And then it's almost as if he got the strength that he needed to say, but if it's not as I will, but as you will. And even as Christ is facing the misery that was coming, and he knew it, him being deity, he could already feel the nails, I believe. He knew exactly what he was about to suffer. And even in that, he was content to obey the Father's will. And you and I, my friends, when things aren't going our way, it may be hard. Life may not be pleasant, and circumstances are not what we planned, but none of us are facing what Christ was facing, and even in that, he was content. And it ought to lead me to find some level of contentment, even in my struggles and in my difficulty, that if he could go to the cross content to do the Father's will, then I can live this life content to do my Father's will. And so I ought to compare my situation to what I deserve, and it'll keep my perspective right. I should compare my situation to those around me. That'll keep my perspective right. I should compare it to those who were in the past that have lived difficult lives. And then I lastly should compare my circumstances to what they once were. I should compare my circumstances now to what they once were. And I don't mean physically your circumstances, but spiritually your condition. If you're a child of God, and we're here on a Wednesday night, flip over to Ephesians chapter 2, just over one book, a couple of pages. I've quoted a bunch of scripture, but let's look at this one together. We talk about comparing our current situations to what we were. I'm going to give you a real quick, we could preach a message here, but I'm going to give it to you very quickly. Chapter 2, verses 1, 2, 3, and 4, what we find is what we were. We were dead, we were deluded, we were disobedient, we were defiled, we were defamed, we were doomed. All of those things there in chapter 2, verse 1 and 2, you find, he says, and you hath he quickened, and here he describes what we were, who were dead in trespasses and sin, where in time past ye walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now worketh in the children of disobedience, among whom also we had our conversation in time past in the lust of our flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, even as others. And then there's a but. But God, who is rich in His mercy for His great love wherewith He loved us, even when we were dead in sin, look at, he says, hath he quickened us together with Christ. Skip down to verse number 12. That at the time ye were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers from the covenants of the promises, having no hope and without God in the world, but now in Christ Jesus, ye who sometimes were afar off are made nigh by the blood of Christ. For He is our peace, who hath made both one and hath broken down the middle wall partition between us. You know what middle wall of partition he's talking about? That's the veil that separated a holy God from a sinful man. He's broken down that wall, having abolished in His flesh the enmity. The enmity simply means warfare, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances, for to make in Himself of twain one new man. Look, he says, so making peace. When I compare my circumstances from what they were before I was saved, to keep my perspective straight. Because I was, chapter 2, verse 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's what I was. I was, he said, you were dead, so we were all dead. We were deluded. He said, in time past, we walked according to the course of this world. That is, we didn't even know we didn't even know what was going on. He said we were disobedient. We were children of disobedience. He said we were defiled. Among them also, we had our conversation where we were fulfilling the lust of the flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind. And then we were doomed. He says in verse number 4, but God who is rich in mercy. And so when circumstances are not what I want them to be, when life is miserable, when it is a struggle just to get through the day, there are some things that I need to be reminded of that will help me be content. The way Apostle Paul said it, in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. And the way that we find contentment is we are comparing our circumstances to some other things. We need to be reminded that our former spiritual state was that we were enemies of God, Romans chapter 5 and verse number 10. Ephesians 2:12 says we were hopeless. We were strangers. He says we were alien from the commonwealth of Israel. That means we just were not even part of God's family. I don't like that phrase when somebody says we're all God's children. No, we are not all God's children. That is not an accurate phrase. We're all God's creation, but in order to be God's children, we have to be born again into the family of God. And so our former spiritual state was that we were strangers. We were not in the family of God. We were aliens, and we were helpless, and we were enemies. But now we realize how much God has blessed us in our current conditions, making us joint heirs with Christ, giving us access to God by faith, giving us help and hope in this life when we are struggling. Even in the worst circumstances, you're not left to wander aimlessly. Aren't you thankful for that? All the way back to the Old Testament nation of Israel when God brought them out of Egypt and across the Red Sea, and here they are in the wilderness where they are for 40 years. Have you ever thought about the fact that even in the 40 years that they're wandering, they weren't wandering aimlessly? They were going where God wanted them to go, even among that route. It seems crazy to me. But God had, even though from here to here, I think it's 3 days, they could have gone from Egypt to Canaan. It took them 40 years. Even in that 40 years, their steps were guided by God. If you get into the book of Leviticus, he begins to give out how this is supposed to work. And God said, look, when you see the cloud that's by day and the pillar of fire by night, when you see it begin to move, pack up and follow it. When it stands still, just stay still. Follow it where you go. When they crossed the River Jordan, they were to follow the Ark of the Covenant, because even when it seemed like they were wandering aimlessly with no destination in sight, because remember, God had told them 40 years, you're not going anywhere. Even then, God's mercy and grace is leading them along the way. And what we don't know is for that 40 years, think about this, for 40 years they didn't encounter an enemy in that wilderness. And if you look at the geographical landscape there, it's not a wide open, vast territory. You had Egypt to the south, you had Canaan in the north, you had countries on both sides, and yet there they are for 40 years, safe and sound. Because even when it feels like God is not moving us anywhere, even in the times when we're standing still in our lives, He's still directing us. He's given us His presence, and so we have hope and help even in this life. Our physical condition even is blessed, no matter how difficult. And you say, well, preacher, you don't know what I'm going through. No, I don't, but here's what I do know. That you and I as children of God, when we suffer, and sometimes we will suffer. In fact, Jesus said all who live godly will suffer. Even when we suffer, for you and I, there's purpose to it. This separates us from the ungodly. When my life is a challenge, when my life is gone horribly wrong, even in that there's a purpose. And here's what's astounding to me. Even when it's my own fault, God's able to work that out and still help me work and pull me through that. And so even when I'm physically struggling, these things are for a purpose. The saved have difficulty, but the difficulty is always working towards an end. We have assurance that God knows what we are going through. The Apostle Paul said, we have not a high priest which cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted, like as are we, yet without sin. We have a God who feels our pain. We have a God who knows what we're going through. He's experienced our emotions. He's had a bad day. He's been tired. He's lost loved ones. He's been persecuted. He's had other people dictate what he had to do. He's been treated poorly by people for no good reason. He's been taken for granted. He's been through all of that. And when our circumstances are contrary to us, and it seems like Alex Trebek, 2020 needs to end. Alex Trebek is gone. It's time for 2020 to come to an end. It's just ridiculous. Just crazy. Even in the middle of all of this, with the uncertainty of our political system moving forward, for at least for the next few weeks, even with the COVID-19 seemingly not going away anytime soon, even in the middle of all of this, I don't know what it is that you've probably had circumstances that we don't even know about that you're struggling with. Whatever it is, if we'll keep a biblical perspective, it will help us with contentment in the middle of difficulty. And that's not to say that it will make you happy all the time. It just won't. But the right perspective will make the little things in life not be big things. Have you noticed how sometimes we have the tendency to do that? Make little things big things? It's not healthy. We try to, with our kids, we try to look, don't worry, that's not worth it. Don't argue over that, especially when two kids go arguing over something that literally does not matter. It's like, stop it. This is a little tiny thing. It's not worth an argument. And plus, I have a headache now. And in our lives, sometimes we let little things, in the grand scheme of things, become something large to us. Our perspective is off. And so, what I'm saying to us tonight, to me and to you as well, when we begin to struggle in life, and whatever the circumstances may be, let's keep our perspective straight. Let's be reminded that what I'm enduring, what I'm going through, what I'm living through in my life is not as bad as I deserve. Let's be reminded that in the middle of this, no matter what the struggle is, someone is having a harder time than I am. Somebody's having a harder time than me. Let me be reminded in the middle of whatever I'm going through that Christ lived a life that was much more difficult than the one that I'm living. How can I complain? He suffered more than I'm suffering. Let's compare it to our former state before we were saved and be reminded that no matter what we go through now, this is all temporary because forever's coming soon. And when forever gets here, folks, all of this stuff won't matter. In fact, the Apostle Paul said that what we're going to is not even worthy to be compared to what we're enduring down here. So stay encouraged and stay content. The Apostle Paul giving us a lesson on contentment from a prison cell, that's pretty apt. I think you and I, as we go through this life, we can take some lessons and be content based on our perspective. Lord, would you bless us as we go the rest of our week? Help us not just to keep our perspective by looking at those around us, but God, give us some sympathy and some empathy for those who are suffering worse than we are. Help us to look to lighten burdens instead of making them heavier. to encourage folks who are discouraged rather than making it worse. God, I don't know all of the circumstances of the people in this room. There's not many of us, but somebody's struggling tonight. Would you help us with perspective? To be reminded that this is not going to last long. Whatever we're going through is not really as big a deal maybe as we think it is, because eternity's coming. Would you help us to react to our difficulties the way that you'd have us to, so that we can be a witness and a testimony to those that are lost around us? Bless those people that are on our prayer list, God, and we're asking that you'll have your perfect will done in our church. Thank you for what you've done for us so far in protecting us from the COVID-19, and continue your hand of protection and be with those churches that are struggling and those who are having a hard time with it. Be with our political leadership and all the things that are going on. God, your will be worked out there. We know that you're the one that puts the kings on the throne, and that you can steer them the way that you want to. So we'll just trust you for it. Help us to be obedient to you as we go the rest of this week. Of course, in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. We'll see you Sunday morning.